Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Want to welcome to the program Tariq Habash. He is a former senior official at the Department of Education under President Biden. Now founder and director of the organization A New Policy with Josh Paul. Tariq, welcome to the program. You were a former senior official at the Department of Education, but not because Kamala Harris lost the election and Donald Trump came in. You were former while Joe Biden was still president. Tell us why.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Sam. And that's exactly right. I was at the Department of Education. I was a political appointee, and I was there from the very beginning of the administration, working on federal policy related to racial equity, to higher education, to student debt. And I left in January of 2024 because of the president's policies towards Palestinians in Gaza. As a Palestinian American myself, I felt very deeply the connection with what was happening and how our policies were not only bad for Palestinians in the region, but bad for Americans and bad for American policy. And despite my efforts to communicate that to the White House, through the secretary himself even, it was very clear that the administration had really no willingness to change on those policies. And the reality was there was a political barrier there. There was a political unwillingness to recognize not just the humanity of Palestinians, but what we were doing as being just outside of, American interests and American values. And when, Josh and I started talking about what we were experiencing, him at the State Department, me at Education, it was very clear the political barriers were the fundamental problem. And this is something that spans beyond partisan issues. This is an issue, unfortunately, that Democrats and Republicans have really been poor on for a long time. And I think we recognized in that moment that we needed to build an organization to address the political realities, that we needed American policy to reflect the interests of everyday Americans. And that means not sending billions of dollars of weapons to kill Palestinian children on the other side of the world when, people are starving here at home, when people are suffering from job loss and inflation and housing issues here at home. I think that message was partially communicated through the election, but I think even now we're still seeing a disconnect between the Democratic Party and its base, between the Republican Party and its voters. I think there are millions of Americans that don't feel like they have a political home. And so we wanted to create a new policy to do just that, to build on this movement that we've been seeing for over a year across the country, that is responsive to those facts and realities for everyday Americans.
Yeah, I want to, I think just add to what you said that I don't know that the entirety of Harris's loss is a function of that policy, but it certainly, undoubtedly, was a major contributing factor. And recent polling, this is what is fascinating. Donald Trump is not going to be punished by large parts of the Republican Party for his policies towards Gaza and the Palestinians, and the idea that we'll level the place and just put up hotels, and Palestinians will find some other place to live, wherever it is he thinks that they should go. The Republican Party it's not inconsistent with their worldview. Recent polling, I think it was Gallup, came out and showed that really a large majority of Democrats now are of the mind that we need to change our policy towards Israel and the Palestinian people. In fact, they're more sympathetic with the Palestinians than they are with the Israelis. And it has made, I think there was always a slight sort of like tension between certainly the Democratic base and where Democratic politicians were with in terms of Israel and Gaza. Although I have to say Biden went much further than I think that any other Democrat I've seen in allowing Israel free hand. But they're really out of sync now, and it's hard to imagine that this issue is going to have any less salience going forward than it does today for the Democratic Party. And that is very problematic for the Democratic Party.
I totally agree. I would argue that it would probably have more salience based on what we're seeing happening here at home.
It's hard to imagine it won't.
Yeah, the reality is, like, Palestine is, for better or worse, it's the cutting edge issue for American politics today, and not just because of what's happening overseas and what we're allowing to happen. The fact that Trump is now sending billions of dollars more in weapons through emergency orders to the Israeli government, despite there being like a supposed ceasefire. Like the reality of what's happening here at home to American citizens, to legal permanent residents, for speaking out, speaking about their own political perspectives on the issue, on what they believe is just unacceptable for our country, our institutions to be investing in. And to see the type of repression reverberate from the president himself, from the federal government, to see ICE at an individual's doorsteps who is here legally and has not violated any laws, as confirmed by the White House themselves just a couple of days ago. Like, this is an issue that affects every single American, whether or not you believe in Palestinian rights and the humanity of Palestinians. And if you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in American civil liberties, you have to recognize that this is an issue that affects all of us. And if you think that it's just about Palestine now, you're sorely mistaken. It's going to come for every single one of us. This is how authoritarianism works. This is how fascism starts. And unfortunately, that's where we are today.
I don't think it's a coincidence that they chose a permanent resident. This is a green card holder, married to an American with a child on the way. I mean, if there was almost any other profile other than this guy was promoting a free Palestine, it would be a much more cut and dry case in terms of like where the Democratic Party lines up on this, where the media lines up on this. I mean, this was in my estimation, a deliberate move by the Trump administration to find the sort of wedge issue within the context of where Democrats writ large are, their leadership is, and the media is, and to build this project of being able to expand their ability to deport people, arrest people. I mean, I don't know if you could say he's arrested because he hasn't been even, as far as I know, charged with a crime. He's just being detained in some way. And I don't know if we have another example of something like this. I don't ever recall a similar example of this type of like vague detention for someone based upon having protests that are aligned in some way. I'm not even sure what that word means. I mean, what has been your perspective on the response by Democratic lawmakers? I have a letter that was sent by, I think it was basically a dozen Congress people. And then I have another letter that was sent by AOC, Democratic lawmakers in New York State. But then you have other ones where Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer spend about 45 minutes of a letter basically saying, defending Israel.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there is not a united front to protect, the First Amendment, to protect the Constitution. I don't think it should be controversial. Democrat, Republican, anyone, if you're elected to higher office, it should be innate that you defend the Constitution and every individual's freedoms that are protected by that document. That should be a non-starter. And so I don't want to just blame Democrats here. I think Republicans' silence in the face of Trump's increasing authoritarian effort here is really concerning. Republicans need to be standing out as well. But the fact that Democrats as an opposition party can't even, in a unified voice, take a step and say, it does not matter, this is unacceptable, this is unconstitutional, this is un-American, that's concerning. And the fact that you have leaders of, the Senate congressional delegation, the House Majority Leader, effectively engaging in anti-Palestinian rhetoric prior to just defending the First Amendment, that's really concerning. That does not bode well for where we are as Americans. And I hope things change. We do have a lot of leaders who have been very vocal and have not qualified, their defense of the Constitution. I think Senator Chris Murphy was very, very direct. I think there's a lot of hope there. And I think that a lot of members of Congress can take cues from some of those leaders.
We're going to play that clip a little later in the program. So what is, before we pivot to what's happening at the DOE, the objective of a new policy, the organization that you have started with Josh Paul, what is tactically, strategically, what are the objectives? Because it seems like, I mean, I know if it's a nonpartisan organization, but the Democratic Party seems to be the lowest of hanging fruit in terms of like change, but it really is. They're really boxed in, those leaders. It seems to me that some of these elected leaders are really boxed in. And at one point they've got to decide, we're not going to allow AIPAC and DMFI with basically Republican money to come and start to dictate where the direction of the party is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, frankly, the DNC has a responsibility to prevent that type of money from entering their primaries, because that is largely where the biggest impact has been in recent elections. And we've seen Democrats get primaried from the right, from a exclusively pro-Israel stance, and often minority Democrats, Democrats who are Black, who are getting primaried because of their position on human rights for Palestinians. And you're right. I think what we are doing with a new policy is recognizing that there are political barriers that just exist that should not be there. We need American politicians to work for the American people. And the reality is that our current policies of unconditional support to the Israeli government as it commits war crimes, as it withholds humanitarian aid, as it cuts off electricity, that's not good for people in the region, of course, but it's bad for American global standing. It's bad for American national security in the near and long term. And it's bad for Americans here at home who are watching billions of dollars go to another country's military instead of getting invested here at home as we're suffering because of rising costs due to inflation, because of corporate greed. There's no effort by Donald Trump and his administration to actually address the real problems that Americans are facing. And I think what we are trying to communicate is his willingness to allow AIPAC to write his talking points ultimately undermines American credibility and his credibility as a president who purportedly cares about the interests of everyday Americans. You don't get to say, oh, we are cutting off investments in other countries and all these like programs and aid except for Israel. Like that is really what he is doing. He is fast tracking billions of dollars of 2,000-pound bombs instead of just making sure that Americans here at home are feeling less pain because of the natural disasters that they've experienced over the last 6 months. That's not American. It's not good for anyone.
All right. I want to turn to the other non-American thing, one of the other that you have insight to that the president is doing that is not helpful, to say the least, to Americans. And that is, it was announced overnight, essentially, that the DOE was about to lose about half of its staff. This is coming after Republicans shut down the SAVE program. Will you just walk us through the different types of, or a couple of the loan forgiveness programs that were shut down and what this is going to mean? My understanding is the Trump administration is saying we don't want to be in the business of providing loans, of really doing anything regarding loans. So they're going to privatize the loan business. It's all going to be private loans. And also the administration of the existing loans, which, just like, as I say that, I know it's going to be an incredible crap show. But will you just walk us through what that means too for people? Because there's also for the public service loan forgiveness program, where they've deemed if you're doing the kind of public service we don't like, all of a sudden, all bets are off.
Donald Trump is weaponizing the entire federal government against vulnerable people, and that includes students, plain and simple. What he is doing to every aspect of the Department of Education shows that he's not actually interested in education at all. He's not interested in its core mission. The Department of Education was founded as a civil rights agency in the midst of schools and colleges not wanting to desegregate. This is like the purpose of the Department of Education primarily is to provide equal opportunity to all Americans to access a high quality education. That's what we have always done since its inception. And
let me just add, I just got to say this, the prototype of this came in Reconstruction, when in fact the Department of Education was to make sure that in fact freed slaves had the ability to become full citizens. I mean, education in this country has always been a function of making sure that there was equal education.
That's exactly right. Education is a human right. It's in the UN doctrine as well. But the reality is what Donald Trump is doing, he doesn't care about the core functions of the Department of Education. He wants to turn the Department of Education into a propaganda machine to be able to spew whatever political ideologies that he wants, and anything else is really antithetical to that. And so when it comes to increasing access to education at the K-12 level, higher education, any of those types of programs, that's really like not part of his vision for what it looks like. And if you can hand it off to the private sector, great, let's do that. This is an idea that Republicans have always touted. But if you look back to the Great Recession, we actually had a lot of private lenders in the education finance market. We had what was known as a guaranteed student loan program, where the government guaranteed private loans. So the idea that like this is somehow new, it's actually not, and it cost a lot more money before. We were able to make historic investments in the Pell Grant program because we switched from a privately guaranteed loan program to a federally financed, federally originated loan program. So this goes back decades already, but we also are in a situation where we are seeing drastically rising costs in education. We have been seeing this for years and years. And so going back to the Bush years, we started to see, and even the Reagan years, we started to see repayment programs that allowed people to pay their loans back based on what income that they made, so that you didn't have student loan payments that were so exorbitant that you couldn't afford to also pay your mortgage or to buy food for your kids or to pay for medicine if you got sick. And these income-based, income-driven repayment programs became more generous as the years went on because costs started rising. College became less and less affordable. We were making less actual investments in education, and schools were relying more on this debt finance model. And so long as the government allowed people to repay a portion of their income instead of here is a set balance, you have to pay this no matter what, it was a little bit more fungible. And the SAVE program was designed to make sure that people's student loans not only were affordable, but that your balance did not grow exorbitantly. And this is something that we had seen in recent years, is that borrowers would be making payments for years and years and years, but because of loan mismanagement and frankly, because of high interest rates, no one was ever seeing progress on the payments that they were
weren't
making.
Paying down their principal. They just kept paying interest over like 10, 20, 30 years.
So what we did at the Department of Education under the Biden administration was actually say, okay, if you have unpaid interest and you can't pay it all off, instead of it capitalizing into the principal, we're just going to pay it off for you, because you are obviously suffering some financial hardship, and it's not fair to you if you're doing everything you're supposed to do to have to take on that extra burden. So let's just make it a little bit easier for Americans that are like forced essentially just to be able to get a career to take on this massive level of debt. And Republicans said, no, we don't like that. We don't want you to actually help vulnerable borrowers. We don't want to make higher education more affordable. We want this to be as difficult as possible. And when it comes to public service loan forgiveness, this is one of the most important programs that was actually created by George W. Bush, by the way, passed with bipartisan support in Congress. It's been around since 2007. And the program is essentially designed for people who work in the public sector, people who work for the government at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, people who work for colleges and universities, people who work in nonprofit spaces where pay just does not match the private sector. This is teachers and nurses and social workers and firefighters who are eligible for this program. And the Trump administration said, you know what? We're going to change the rules. We're not going to allow everyone to be eligible if you work on specific issues that we don't like. So Palestinian rights types of organizations that work on immigration rights issues, people who work on gender equity issues and trans rights issues. We don't want those organizations to be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. And that's really dangerous, because that is a clear shot across the bow by the Trump administration to say, we get to decide who benefits financially from these federal programs that were created by Congress for anyone working in public service. And the way that the rules are designed, it is agnostic to whatever policies or politics that you have. If you are serving the public good, if you're helping vulnerable people, if you're getting underpaid because the type of organization that you work for is not profit making and profit seeking, there should be some sort of benefit to you as someone working for public's benefit. And that's what this program was supposed to do. So if you work for 10 years in that space, the rest of your loans, as long as you've been paying for 10 years, they get canceled, they get forgiven, they're wiped away, and you can work and you can survive without that debt looming over your head. And Donald Trump said, no, we want to weaponize this in a way that people will not want to fight for trans rights and will not want to fight for immigrant rights and Palestinian rights. And that's really, again, I hate to say it, it's un-American. A lot of the things that Donald Trump is doing right now are not good for Americans.
And I would add that the plans that they're floating now, your interest rate and your accessibility to loans will be a function of what kind of course load you take. So they are going to steer people into a specific chosen fields that will supposedly have, actuarially speaking, a higher return on investment, which of course then makes it tougher to get loans to become a teacher, to become a social worker, to do all the things that are already underpaid and undervalued in our society significantly, that are meant to further and better society as opposed to putting dollars in your pocket. And it's going to discourage people from going in there. We're going to end up having all sorts of problems down the road because you're making it that much harder for people to go in and do essentially broadly public service in many ways. Let me ask you this question. I got a couple more. From your perspective, could the Biden administration have done something differently in terms of forgiving student debt during the years you were there?
Yes. I do think that we could have approached it in a much different way. We could have leaned into the fact that this was always going to be politicized, and we could have said, this is automatic. The secretary clearly has the authority. I think we made that legal determination fairly early on. We just wanted to know how to do it to make it most equitable and to make sure that, people who didn't really need relief didn't have to get it. But like, if you take out student loans, it's not because like, oh, I want to take out student loans. It's because you have to. And so I feel like on a baseline, it shouldn't matter if your income was a certain level. If you have it, we should provide relief, especially given the impact that COVID actually had on millions of Americans, their job security, their just entire lives were,
So you're saying that like early on, they should have just gone in, done it, get it over with.
Done it, automate it,
and
don't
then
create an application because the
apologize
application
afterwards.
Exactly. Ask for forgiveness, make it a lot harder. And then if Republicans sue and win, it's like, okay, we tried to do this. We made a promise. We kept our promise. Republicans stopped it. Like, you can say it in the way, we can still make that point right now, but the reality is that like we could have been more aggressive. And what Donald Trump is doing is exactly, by the way, that, but he's doing more
the opposite,
clearly illegal stuff in a politicized way. And he's saying, I'm king, I get to do whatever I want. It doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that all of it will hold up, but Democrats and the Biden administration was not willing to do what was necessary to make sure that vulnerable borrowers were getting relief that they needed and deserved and were eligible for.
Yeah, I mean, they're broadly, this is all a perfect illustration of the Republicans doing essentially, and then cleaning up the mess afterwards, as it were. In terms of the cuts to the DOE, do you know anything about special education? Will you just tell people what the DOE does in terms of special education, special needs, children who have learning challenges? Or atypical, neuroatypical, or have other atypical qualities that make it difficult to get an education. How does the DOE help with that?
Department of Education helps tremendously on so many of those fronts. There are numerous laws on the books created by Congress that essentially authorize the Department of Education not only to provide a substantial amount of resources to schools at the K-12 level and higher education to make sure that they are equally serving students with developmental and intellectual disabilities, particularly because public schools cannot turn away students in the way that private schools often do, but also to make sure that they're complying with those laws, to make sure that everyone is actually not only using those resources appropriately, but making sure that they are equally serving those students, that the students are getting what they need. There are a lot of different offices that collaborate on this work, that oversee these grants. A lot of them have been gutted. One of them works specifically on rehabilitative services and grants for people, both for individuals who are in the workforce and needing additional support for workforce training, and also for students who just need additional support in the educational process. There's also a lot of this work that overlaps with the Office for Civil Rights, which has been decimated just in the last 24 hours. There's so many important factors that the Department of Education does to ensure equal opportunities for all students. And I know Linda McMahon, before she was confirmed by the Senate, was asked about these programs very clearly and very specifically, IDEA being one, a lot of the rehabilitative services programs, civil rights. And she said, we are not going to do anything outside of the authority that Congress has given us. I would argue that these reductions in force make it impossible for the Department of Education to effectively do its job, and frankly undermine the integrity of the entire agency and undermine Congress's authorization of the agency.
When it seems that the things that the DOE did, the impact of them not doing these are going to be felt more significantly in red states than in blue states, right? Because the DOE had to come in and make sure that states that were hostile to public education, hostile to providing services for all their citizens, were actually providing these services. And so in states that were more inclined to do this in the first place, ostensibly if there is a frankly more progressive, liberal, left, whatever you want to call blue states, is that an accurate assessment?
Absolutely. I would say not only that, but this is just part of the Trump administration's entire whole of government weaponization to ensure that states, districts, schools across the country, no matter where they are, comply with the political directives of the Trump administration, whether it's on diversity and equity, whether it's about messaging, whether it's about cracking down on student speech. It doesn't matter what the issue is. They are weaponizing all of government to ensure that Americans feel some level of fealty to this president. And it's really dangerous. It's really, really dangerous for what it means for students who are vulnerable. It's dangerous for what it means for rural communities that already are under-resourced and need more support. It's dangerous for students in urban areas where the Department of Education has already been politically weaponized through their propaganda and their press releases. They're coming after Americans everywhere. And we all have an obligation to stand up and push back, to fight back. And what we're seeing on college campuses in particular, the fact that we've seen Columbia essentially adhere to every single requirement of the Trump administration to say, yes, sir, jump. Okay, we'll jump. You want us to shut down this speech? We'll do that. You want cops on our campus? We'll do that. They are preemptively agreeing to everything that Republicans, that Virginia Fox, Elise Stefanik, now Donald Trump.
That's exactly what academics say you don't do with an authoritarian leadership. All right, lastly, let me ask you one question, a question that probably won't be more relevant for, frankly, 3 or 4 years. But how does, you said you're a political appointee to the DOE, which means that you came in as part of the new administration. I don't think, my guess is that you have a personal relationship with Joe Biden, that you probably never met him. How does that happen? Like I've tried to articulate in the past that you're not electing a president. You're electing people, I don't know, who are in, way out in the co-centric circles from the presidency, but they know people who you're going to want to be in these offices, as opposed to who Donald Trump knows people who wants to be. Like, how did you get that job?
Great question. I worked in higher education policy, student loan policy for over a decade. I also worked in democratic politics for a long time. And because of my experience, the relationships that I had, my expertise, the campaign, actually numerous campaigns during the primaries asked me to help support on policy items related to student loans and racial equity. I happily obliged. When Biden was the presumptive nominee, they were putting together what are called like policy committees. And I was asked to help support the drafting and organizing of a lot of those policy ideas to help, hand off something to the transition if Joe Biden was elected. That's what happened. And then eventually, because of, the work that I did, because of the work I had historically done, I got a call from the transition to interview and, took the call to service. I think for me, it was about serving the American people. It was about enacting an agenda that was focused on providing equal opportunity and improving educational opportunity for millions of Americans. It was something that I cared about really deeply. It wasn't a job that I, this is just like another job, check the box. Like I cared about it. I worked tirelessly to support a vision that was inclusive for all Americans. And I didn't take publicly resigning lightly because of an issue that I didn't get to work on directly. But as I said, Palestine is a cutting edge issue. And it was very clear the dissonance that students across America were already feeling in the early days and weeks of the president's unwillingness to pull back or use any sort of leverage with Netanyahu and the Israeli regime. And for me, it felt like an inevitability. If we weren't going to actually equally protect students on college campuses, if there was no way that I could make college campuses safer for students that looked like me, I had no business representing the administration.
Tariq Habash, former senior official at the Department of Education under Biden, founder and director of the organization A New Policy. We will put a link to A New Policy. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.